No pseudo-medieval fantasy epic feels complete without the protagonist entering a seedy tavern filled with drunken louts. But as with many common medievalisms, this image is not the best reflection of what medieval taverns were probably like. Join me today as I contemplate how medieval taverns should be envisioned. Hi, I'm Sam. Welcome to Footnoting History. Today, I'm going to revisit my very first episode, which looked at medieval taverns. As I was preparing for my most recent episode, Beer Through the Ages, I went back to listen to that early episode again and discovered that there were a lot of things I could do better now. And I'm not just talking about the sound quality, though that was an issue too. So I'm going to give it another try. Let's get started, shall we? Taverns are frequently envisioned as bleak, rowdy places occupied exclusively by men except for the occasional buxom serving wench. This popular image, however, does not match the depiction of drinking establishments in medieval sources, which suggest that drinking establishments were spaces of conviviality and celebration. Moreover, as semi-domestic spaces, taverns were accessible to and utilized by women, both as proprietors and patrons. This podcast focuses on England in the 14th and 15th centuries. This was an age before strict licensing requirements, which were implemented in 1552, led to a formalization of drinking establishments. So while there was a broad difference between taverns, which were comparatively wealthy establishments that could afford to sell wine, and alehouses, comparatively humbler establishments that, as their name suggests, sold primarily ale and later beer, these divisions were not strictly observed, and people often just sold ale right out of their homes. In the first half of the 14th century, drinking establishments were invariably identified in the records by the names of their proprietors. So they appear as the Tavern of Henry of Coventry or the Beer Tavern in the house of Thomas de Stanton. Sometimes the named proprietor was a woman. Alice de Wootham, for example, served ale in her home, and Agnes de Nottingham operated a tavern. The fact that taverns were named for their proprietors suggests that drinking establishments were often informal or even temporary. Moreover, since people were selling ale out of their homes, they might only have functioned as drinking houses when a brewer had a product to distribute. This makes sense given the supplementary and irregular nature of the brewing industry in the early 14th century. But, as I detailed in my episode about beer, the later 14th century saw changes in the brewing industry, wherein the introduction of hops allowed fermented beverages to remain stable for a longer period of time. Thereafter, the brewing industry gradually acquired more status, and men began to take over the business. It's not surprising that even as the process of brewing was becoming more streamlined, drinking establishments were also becoming more formalized. Here, too, we can consider the evidence of evolving naming patterns. It's only in the years following the Black Death that taverns began to be assigned descriptive, enduring names like the Cardinal's Hat or the Tavern at the Sign of the Greyhound. Because these taverns were not named after their proprietors, they were presumably less transient. I should not overstate this shift, however. There were still some drinking establishments identified only by the names of their proprietors well into the 17th century. Throughout our period, establishments selling wine or ale by the glass were supposed to be marked by a pole, a sign, or a broom. These signs allowed ale conners, officials charged with regulating drink sales, to come and test brews and to ensure that the correct prices were being charged. I would like to pause for a moment to emphasize that the price of the most important foodstuffs, bread and ale, were regulated in the Middle Ages in order to protect consumers. This concern to make sure that people could afford food is commonly overlooked. Anyway, anyone who sold drink without a sign could be fined. Although some drinking establishments utilized permanent signs, many signs were impermanent fixtures that could be taken down when alcohol was not being sold. The use of poles or brooms as signs reinforces my previous conclusion that sales could be initiated with limited investment in infrastructure. Although residences could be used as drinking houses without making any permanent changes to them, it was also possible to use partitions to separate public drinking space from the living space. Alternatively, proprietors could devote a room or a cellar to accommodate their patrons. There are even a handful of surviving building contracts that demonstrate a few taverns were specifically being built to accommodate crowds of guests. The Peter and Paul Tavern in London, for example, seems to have had multiple rooms large enough to accommodate 30 patrons apiece. In most cases, though, Drinking places, like the spaces used for other commercial activities, were concentrated on the ground level, which allowed cellars to be readily accessible and avoided the inconvenience of carrying beverages up several flights of stairs. While alehouses could be quite simple, any place selling wine needed to have a cellar in which to store it. Some taverns had multiple cellars, which they could use to store different types of wine. These cellars had to be accessible to customers. Repeated legislation specifies that neither curtain nor bolted door could obstruct the doorway to a cellar, and that customers could accompany their servers into the basement to receive their wine. While it's likely that some smaller drinking establishments were run solely by the proprietor, larger establishments employed servants. It seems that these servants could even run taverns in the absence of their masters. In 1277, for example, a London taverner named Simon had a prolonged dispute with his servant. One night, the servant came into Simon's bedchamber and beheaded him. The next evening, the servant opened the tavern and served wine as usual. After closing up shop that night, he left town. Simon's body was discovered several days later by concerned neighbors. The lack of suspicion when Simon did not appear in his tavern suggests that it was not unusual to delegate responsibility for running taverns to servants. This account also implies that taverns were not expected to be open every day, since it took the neighbors several days to realize that something was wrong when the establishment remained closed. Although owners relied on servants, there were some obligations that fell to the proprietor. The taverner was responsible for ensuring that their products were of standard quality. Selling bad wine or ale could result in fines, or, in at least one case, having the offended liquid dumped over their heads. Those hosting overnight guests were responsible to inform their guests of local regulations, to report illicit trading, and to vouch for the good behavior of their guests. Hosts fulfilled these obligations to varying degrees. Some taverns blatantly flouted regulations by remaining open after curfew, which could result in official sanctions to both the proprietors and the patrons. Other taverners helped their patrons trade illicitly or sidelined as pimps. The variation in drinking establishments suggests that while some taverners were wealthy and respectable, others were comparatively poor people trying to scrape together a little extra income by brewing and selling ale. Because of their frequent proximity to living spaces, drinking establishments straddled the permeable boundary between public and private. Indeed, the pseudo-domesticity of drinking establishments likely empowered some women to assume a significant role in running these establishments. There's ample evidence that women could be the proprietors of drinking establishments. In 1422, 26 people were reported by a London jury for selling ale from their homes in the wrong size vessels. Of those, 21 were women, suggesting that women were disproportionately likely to be responsible for running informal drinking establishments, or at least that they were more likely to be censured for doing so. But not all women who ran drinking establishments were getting in trouble for their work. In 1331, the taverners of London went on strike to protest a new assize of wine. 2 of the 28 individuals who refused to sell wine at that time were women. This record demonstrates that while women did run taverns independently of men, they were in the minority. Most often, the women who ran formalized taverns, as opposed to informal alehouses, were the widows of taverners and had inherited their husband's estate. The ability of widows to take over their husbands' businesses, however, suggests that they also played a significant role in running drinking houses while their husbands were still alive. Wives would have been particularly important if their spouse had another profession, as taverners frequently did. While it's clear that women functioned as hosts, there was also some discomfort with their assumption of that role. Medieval literary depictions of female taverners and brewsters are uniformly negative. For example, in The Harrowing of Hell, a cycle of Corpus Christi plays dating from the early 15th century, a brewster is the only soul left in hell after Christ has redeemed the worthy souls. The play proclaims Satan as the brewster's sweet master. While literary condemnations tend to focus on the negative impact of excessive drinking and gambling that often accompanied it, there was also a sense that it was unnatural for women to have power over men by controlling drinking establishments. To the extent that proprietors were supposed to police their patrons, there was also concern about women being able to ensure the appropriate behavior of their guests. While drinking houses were once conceptualized as fundamentally male spaces, this conclusion has been thoroughly debunked. In addition to running taverns, women could be patrons in them too. In my study of the surviving medieval court records, about 17% of tavern patrons were women. This number must be taken as a minimum estimate because women, who were perceived as poor witnesses, were more likely to be omitted from the record than men. They were also less likely to be recorded in connection with violent crimes. Most often, the women found in taverns were accompanied by their husbands or by other male acquaintances. Frequently, the women who went to taverns appear to have been engaged in courtship rituals. Taverns provided an opportunity for respectable couples to get to know each other prior to marriage, especially because it was deemed inappropriate for a woman to come to a man's house. In particular, women who were employed as servants needed a respectable space to meet suitors, and the pseudo-domestic and perpetually chaperoned space of a tavern met that need. These spaces likely became increasingly important after the mid-14th century as women increasingly found themselves excluded from other public spaces. But although women could meet men in drinking houses without the support of relatives, they had to be careful because men could construe this behavior to represent a promise of marriage. In fact, a lot of marriages did take place in taverns. Apart from homes and churches, they were the most common wedding venues. Marriages in drinking houses were most often contracted by comparatively poor people who needed a quasi-domestic space that could accommodate witnesses. Drinking houses provided a convenient place to meet and contributed to the celebrations, which were bound to involve alcohol no matter where they took place. Public acceptance of marriages contracted in taverns demonstrates that drinking houses could be respectable spaces. Although the evidence demonstrates that drinking houses hosted respectable social and courtship-related activities for women, they also frequently associated with the sex trade. Because alcohol was perceived to be a sexual stimulant, sex workers sometimes sought patrons in drinking houses. Establishments with available rooms occasionally rented them to sex workers and their clients, and some brothels also sold ale. But not all drinking houses permitted illicit sexual activity. For instance, when a certain Maud suspected that the patrons of the alehouse in her London home were having intercourse, she entered into the cellar and interrupted them. She was then struck by the man who was pulling up his trousers. While it's possible that as a female proprietor, Maud felt acute pressure to maintain a chaste environment lest she be tarnished with rumors of being a procuress, her example proves that at least some hosts tried to maintain their establishments as respectable spaces more geared toward socialization than to criminal enterprises or sexual liaisons. So here's the thing to remember. People could brew their own ale, or they could purchase comparatively cheap drinks in the street from hucksters, which begs the question, why did medieval people pay more to frequent drinking houses? Their appeal must have come in part from their convivial atmosphere and from the shelter from the elements they offered. Much like pubs and bars in the present day, people amused themselves in taverns with conversation and gossip. Storytellers visited drinking establishments, sometimes expecting to be plied with drink before telling their tales. Numerous songs dating from the medieval period indicate that drinking was perceived to be a joyous, communal activity. Tavern goers also came to the attention of the courts by playing illicit games, including checkers, hazard, and dice. Although these games could be rigged or end in disputes, they were intended primarily for entertainment. Though the medieval evidence is limited, it's possible that drinking establishments, though not as formalized as guilds or parishes, were beginning to emerge as a place where people could form meaningful bonds of camaraderie and friendship. Taverns could also host commercial transactions, despite laws that explicitly prohibited commercial activity in inns and taverns. The perceived necessity of these laws suggests that people were engaging in business in drinking establishments, which provided convenient places for merchants to meet, to make deals, and even to execute transactions, thereby avoiding civic authorities and their fees. Beyond allowing people to skirt tolls, drinking establishments ensured the availability of witnesses if one party later defaulted on their side of the bargain and legal action became necessary. Alternatively, transactions could be negotiated in the market and then participants could migrate to a drinking house to share a drink and pay for the goods. In addition to prohibiting trade in drinking houses, medieval authorities feared the potential for disorder that can be associated with drinking. Lawmakers worried that night walkers lurked in taverns waiting their time to do ill. Widespread unease with drinking houses was not unfounded. Criminal records reveal that violence and murder did sometimes occur within drinking houses. Most often, they resulted from heated arguments and disputes over games. In 1301, for example, a tavern brawl in London resulted in a fatality. Another early 14th century record tells the story of the death of a taverner named Stephen, who won money while playing tables at another man's tavern. The loser then tricked Stephen into leaving the tavern and killed him on the street away from witnesses. Often, as demonstrated in this second example, violence either began in the tavern or was incited by activities that took place there. But in many cases, the event that warranted inclusion in the court record, so the actual crime, took place outside the physical space of the drinking house. This pattern suggests that there was some level of safety to be found within the physical space of the tavern. The oversight of a host and the comparative safety of drinking establishments was likely one of their draws. But even if patrons were not likely to be killed in drinking establishments, the fears of lawmakers were justified by the occasional violence that spilled out into the streets. On the whole, the available evidence suggests that drinking establishments were not the dens of vice that modern audiences imagine. While they saw moments of violence that were likely aggravated by excessive drink, there is ample evidence that taverns also provided some measure of safety for their patrons. Their continued popularity, moreover, suggests that the social and business interactions they facilitated outweighed the potential threat they posed and enticed people to spend their hard-earned money for the comforts they provided. So the next time you see a movie depicting gross medieval taverns, keep in mind that you're getting a slice of the modern imagination, not a true depiction of life in the Middle Ages. Though, to be fair, that's probably good advice for most aspects of medieval movies. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode of Footnoting History. If you'd like to learn more, feel free to check out our expanded references list on our website, www.footnotinghistory.com. You can also listen to other episodes in our archives. Until next time, remember, the best stories are always in the footnotes.